There is a number that sits quietly in the back of almost every early investor's mind, a target that feels both achingly close and impossibly far depending on the week, the market, and the mood. That number is $50,000. Not a million, not 500,000, 50,000. And what makes this particular threshold so fascinating, so psychologically loaded, and so mathematically significant is not just how hard it is to reach, it's why it's hard in a way that almost no one explains clearly. Because the difficulty isn't random. It isn't bad luck. It isn't laziness or poor discipline in most cases. The difficulty is structural. It is baked into the way money actually behaves at different stages of accumulation, and once you understand the mechanics behind it, the entire experience of building early wealth starts to make a different kind of sense. Most people who are working toward financial independence for the first time tend to measure their progress in a very linear way. They think about savings rates, monthly contributions, and year-end balances, and they assume that if they stay consistent, the journey should feel roughly the same from start to finish, a steady, predictable climb. But that assumption is one of the most quietly damaging misconceptions in personal finance, because the journey is not linear at all. The early phase of wealth accumulation operates under a completely different set of rules than the later phase, and the emotional, psychological, and mathematical weight of that first $50,000 is heavier than almost any equivalent amount you will ever try to build afterward. Understanding why that is true requires looking at three separate but deeply connected forces: the mathematics of compounding at low balances, the behavioral economics of sacrifice without visible reward, and the systemic design of an economy that makes it structurally harder to save when you have the least. Start with the mathematics, because the math is where most people's intuition breaks down first. Compound interest is one of the most discussed concepts in personal finance, and yet its actual behavior at different account sizes is rarely broken down with honesty. When you have $50,000 invested and you earn a 7% annual return, which is a reasonable long-term approximation for a diversified equity portfolio, you are generating $3,500 in a single year without doing anything. That $3,500 comes from the market, not from your paycheck. It requires no overtime, no side hustle, no sacrifice. It simply appears because the capital is large enough for its returns to become meaningful. But when you have $5,000 invested at that same 7% return, you are generating $350 per year, less than $1 a day. And when you have nothing, when you are starting from zero, which is where most people begin, the compounding engine produces nothing at all because there is no base for it to work from. This is the core mathematical reality that makes the first $50,000 so disproportionately difficult. In the early stages, you are almost entirely dependent on your own labor and discipline to grow the balance, because the portfolio itself is not yet large enough to contribute meaningfully to its own growth. You are doing all of the pushing, and the math is doing almost none of it. Every dollar in that account got there because you earned it, chose not to spend it, and redirected it with intention. That is an exhausting process when sustained over months and years, especially when the visible reward, the number on the screen, grows so slowly that it can feel almost indistinguishable from standing still. Contrast that with the experience of someone who has already crossed $200,000 and is watching their portfolio generate $14,000 a year passively. At that level, the math has become a partner. At the early stages, the math is still a passenger. What makes this even more psychologically complex is the relationship between sacrifice and visible progress during those early years. Human beings are not wired to sustain long-term behavioral change without feedback. We need signals that what we are doing is working. We need evidence that the effort is translating into results. And in the early stages of building wealth, those signals are maddeningly weak. You skip a vacation and save $1,200. You cook at home for 3 months and save maybe $400. You resist upgrading your car, your apartment, your wardrobe for an entire year, and your net worth has grown by perhaps $8,000, which sounds significant until you calculate that at your current rate, you are still 4 to 6 years away from $50,000. The gap between the sacrifice being made today and the payoff that sacrifice will eventually produce is so wide that the human brain struggles to maintain the behavioral connection between them. This is not weakness. This is how behavioral economics works. Delayed gratification becomes exponentially harder to sustain the longer the delay. And in early wealth building, the delay is very long. Psychologists who study financial behavior have identified a phenomenon sometimes called savings fatigue, which describes the motivational erosion that occurs when people are consistently sacrificing present consumption for a future reward that feels abstract and distant. The accounts are growing technically, but the growth doesn't feel real because it doesn't yet translate into anything tangible. You can't feel $50,000 the way you can feel a paid-off vacation or a nicer apartment. It exists as a number, a potential, a foundation, and foundations are invisible by design. This is why so many people abandon savings goals not during periods of financial crisis, but during periods of perfectly ordinary stability. The crisis at least provides an external justification. The ordinary stable period reveals that the internal motivation alone was never quite strong enough to survive the boredom and invisibility of slow early accumulation. Then there is the systemic dimension, which is the layer of this problem that gets discussed the least, perhaps because it requires acknowledging that the difficulty of saving early is not purely a matter of individual behavior. The economic structure most people operate within is designed in a way that places the heaviest financial friction on those with the smallest buffers. Consider the basic architecture of modern financial life for someone in their 20s or early 30s with a median income. Rent or mortgage consumes a large and growing share of monthly income. Transportation, whether a car payment, insurance, maintenance, or transit costs, takes another significant slice. Groceries, utilities, subscriptions, healthcare, and student loan obligations layer on top of that, and what remains after those fixed costs is often not enough to build meaningful savings without genuine sacrifice. The system is not designed to make it easy to accumulate a first $50,000. The system is designed largely to keep consumption flowing, because consumption is what the economy runs on at the aggregate level. Interest rates on credit products are highest for those with the least credit history and the least financial cushion, meaning that any unexpected expense, a car repair, a medical bill, an emergency flight, is most expensive to finance precisely when you can least afford it. Banking fees are most burdensome on low balance accounts. Investment minimums, until relatively recently, excluded small investors from certain asset classes entirely. The financial system at its structural level creates a gravitational pull that works against early accumulation and in favor of later accumulation, which means that the difficulty of reaching that first $50,000 is not just a personal challenge. It is a predictable outcome of the environment most people are trying to save within. Understanding this systemic reality matters not because it provides an excuse to stop trying, but because it reframes the achievement correctly. Reaching $50,000 in net investable assets is genuinely hard in a way that is not proportional to the size of the number. It requires navigating a behavioral gauntlet that rewards patience in an environment optimized for impatience. It requires sustaining sacrifice when the feedback loop is broken. It requires making consistent rational decisions inside an economic system that profits from irrational ones. And it requires doing all of this while the math offers almost no assistance, while the compounding engine sits largely idle, waiting for a balance large enough to run at meaningful power. But here is what the data shows on the other side of that threshold, and why the $50,000 mark has taken on such significance in the financial psychology literature. Once a portfolio crosses into that range and begins moving toward $100,000, the behavioral and mathematical experience of saving begins to shift in subtle but measurable ways. The compound returns, while still not enormous, become visible enough to register as real. A 7% return on $70,000 is nearly $5,000, which feels different than $350. The feedback loop tightens. The motivation becomes slightly easier to sustain because the evidence of progress is slightly more tangible. People who cross the first major threshold tend to accelerate their savings rate rather than relax it, not because their income necessarily increased, but because the psychological relationship with the process changes. The goal, which once felt abstract, begins to feel achievable in a way it simply did not before. This is why financial educators and behavioral economists consistently describe the first $50,000 as the most important money you will ever accumulate. Not the most valuable in absolute terms, not the most impactful on your retirement projections, but the most important in the sense of what it requires you to become in order to get there. It requires building habits, tolerances, and belief systems that the math alone cannot build for you. It requires learning to find meaning in invisible progress. It requires developing a relationship with delayed gratification that is durable enough to survive years, not weeks. And it requires making peace with a system that is not particularly designed to help you, while using the tools that system does provide with as much precision and patience as possible. The first $50,000 is hard because it should be hard, not in a punitive sense, but in the sense that it is doing something to you while you are trying to do something with it. It is building the investor before it builds the portfolio. And when you finally cross it, you will likely find that the number on the screen matters less than the person you had to become to put it there.